So I am going to do a deck profile on Invoked Shaddoll's Dogmatika. I don't have a script or anything like that, so I'm just going to go card by card, explain what they do and kind of why I have them in this deck. Starting off, we have Shaddoll Falco. Shaddoll Falco has a really cool effect where if he is sent to the graveyard by a card effect, he can special summon himself back from the graveyard. And then if he is flipped, he can special summon a Shaddoll monster from the graveyard. So it's just a nice little extender. It's a good way to get a body onto the field. He mostly just comes in handy for defense during my opponent's turn or just as a fusion fodder. Next we have Hedgehog. I just keep this as a one of just because there aren't too many Shaddoll monsters in this deck. It's just kind of handy to send to the graveyard off of Construct or whatever to maybe get a Squamata or a Wendy in my hand. But he's just a niche little one of that I like to run. 3 Ash Blossoms, these are pretty self-explanatory. I don't want my opponent having more cards. It's pretty much all there is. Wendy is arguably the best Shaddoll monster. She essentially special summons from the deck, either through flip summoning or being sent to the graveyard. You can special summon another Shaddoll monster from your graveyard, so you would normally want to target Squamata, potentially a dragon. I like to go into Hell Shaddoll Hollow, which I'll talk about later. Next up, we have Shaddoll Squamata. I run 2 copies of this guy. Flip effect, he can destroy a monster. If he's sent to the graveyard, he can Foolish Burial another Shaddoll card, that being either a monster or one of the spells and traps. Pretty handy card, must have in any Shaddoll deck. Next we have Shaddoll Dragon. I like to run this as 2, just as like the back row removal. That's mostly what I use Dragon for, is his graveyard effect. He does have a flip effect where I can target a card on the field and send it back to the hand. That can come in handy every now and again. But it's mostly just for back row removal. That's his purpose. Going into the invoked portion, we have Alistar the Invoker. Everybody knows what he does. He's a meme for a reason. Great fucking card. Shaddoll Aerial is a nice one of. It's another one of those where like I wish its effect was better, but it serves its purpose well. What it does is when it's flipped, I can target a banished Shaddoll monster and special summon it back onto the field. And if it's sent to the graveyard, I can target up to 3 cards in either a person's graveyard, so my graveyard or my opponent's graveyard, and just straight up banish them. So it's nice to have when you're going against an opponent that likes to use their graveyard. It's just a good way to get rid of their cards. Dogmatica Ecclesia is a really good fucking card. Her ability is she can special summon when there is an extra deck monster on the field. And when she is normal or special summon, so however you get her onto the field, she can then search a Dogmatika card, that being your Dogmatika Punishment or one of the other Dogmatika monsters. Shaddoll Beast, I just have as a one of. His ability is to draw cards. That's always a great thing, but he's mostly just fusion fodder for other Shaddoll monsters. Dogmatika Fleur-de-Lis is probably the best Dogmatika card. It's up there with Ecclesia. I personally like Fleur-de-Lis more than Ecclesia, simply because it's just more useful for disrupting my opponent. So this one is the same deal, where if there is an extra deck monster on the field, he can special summon himself from the hand. Also, if there is another Dogmatika card on the field, a Dogmatika monster, excuse me, you can then target a card and negate its effects. He also has a neat little battling effect. When a Dogmatika monster declares an attack, you can gain 500, and that 500 is a permanent gain. So it's just a good way to get your monsters a little more beefy, and that's something that this deck really struggles with. I will say is there's not a lot of big powerhouse monsters. It's mostly just battling through effects. Next is Dogmatic Maximus. Just another Dogmatika card that just has a really good effect. It isn't summoned the same way as the other 2s are. It requires you to have an extra deck monster in the grave. So you would summon it by banishing an extra deck monster from your grave. And then what you can do is you can activate its effect to send 2 cards from your extra deck to the graveyard, and your opponent does the same. So as Shaddolls, or when playing with Shaddolls, a lot of their extra deck monsters have graveyard effects, and so you don't mind putting your cards into the graveyard, whereas your opponent, unless they're playing Shaddolls, probably doesn't want to get rid of their monsters. So just a nice way to limit what your opponent can do. And then Hell Shaddoll Hollow. A lot of people say this card sucks, and it kind of does. He has a flip effect where you can target a monster that my opponent controls. I have to send from my extra deck to the graveyard a Shaddoll monster with the same attribute as that targeted monster, and then I can then banish my opponent's monster, but they have to have the same attribute. This doesn't come up a lot, mostly because the Shaddoll monsters that I have are pretty much just dark or light. So if my opponent has anything else, not a whole lot I can do. But he is a 2900 powerhouse that is easily summoned through Wendy, so I just run him as a nice one-of. He is nice to have. It's the 2900 attack for me. Going into the spells, we have Shaddoll Fusion, easily the best card in the entire deck. When your opponent controls an extra deck monster, you can fusion summon using materials from your deck. That's really all it is. You don't have to use materials from your deck. You can use materials from your hand, just like a regular polymerization. But just having the option to go into your deck and get rid of the cards that you want to get rid of for whatever scenario you happen to be in is just absolutely fantastic. Next, we run Invocation paired with Alistar. It is a nice to have another polymerization essentially, but you're mostly using this for your invoked summonings. I just run one copy of Lightning Storm just as an extra back row or monster removal if I need it. Nadir Servant is unfortunately limited to only one, but what this does is you send a monster from your extra deck to the graveyard. Ideally, you would want to send your Titanic the Ash Dragon or even your Elder Entity Ints. But once you have met the requirements, you can then add to your hand or special summon a Dogmatika card. So normally you would want to go into your Ecclesia off of Nadir Servant, but if you already have an Ecclesia, you could also grab your Fleur-de-Lis or your Maximus. Magical Meltdown is a really cool card. When paired with Alistar, this card, barring any negations from your opponent, is a Mechaba just by itself. You activate it, add the Alistar to your hand, normal summon Alistar, grab the invocation, so on and so forth. But it also has a secondary effect that a lot of people don't really think about, is it has protection for your fusion summons. So if your opponent wants to try and stop you from fusion summoning, they can't as long as Magical Meltdown is on the field. But a cool little thing with this card is if you have Magical Meltdown and Alistar in your hand, you can actually use the Magical Meltdown to bait your opponent into sending their Ash Blossom too early, because your opponent doesn't want you to have Alistar in your hand. But if you already have them, activate Magical Meltdown, your opponent ashes, normal summon Alistar, and you get a free search on your invocation anyway. Forbidden Chalice is just a card that I have in here just as extra disruptions. I don't want my opponent's monsters to be able to use their effects, and this is just an extra way to make sure that doesn't happen. Shaddoll Fusion, the quick play, I run 2 of these. I really like this card. If anything, just to have to use during my opponent's turn. The ideal playing being to set it along with a Dark and then another Shaddoll monster that is on my field, and then when it's my opponent's turn, flip it to special summon my Winda and lock my opponent from special summoning. A lot of people really just kind of run this as a one-of, or just don't run it at all, because Shaddoll Fusion is significantly better, and it is. I just like to have it for that extra bit of disruption. Called by the Grave, you do a lot of searching in this deck. Pretty much all of the Shaddoll monsters search each other. The invoked cards, they search. Dogmatika searches each other. A lot of searching. You want to have as many called bys as you are allowed to have, in just in case. Shaddoll Incarnation. This is a really cool card. It can special summon a Shaddoll monster from your graveyard, and then while it is in the graveyard, you can banish it and another Shaddoll card to either flip face up or flip face down a monster you control, that being your Shaddoll monsters that you have either flipped or not flipped. This is really cool when paired with Squamata. You could set your Squamata, activate Shaddoll Incarnation in the graveyard, banish itself and another Shaddoll card to then flip your Squamata the same turn that it was set, and then you'll be able to use its flip effect. Dogmatica Punishment paired with the Dogmatika, just card removal. And also, I like to pair this with Elderly Entity Ints. That way I can pop 2 cards instead of just the 1. The only problem is you are locking yourself out of the extra deck. And that is the running issue with all of the Dogmatikas, is once they're activated for the rest of the turn, you can't special summon from the extra deck. So your Dogmatika plays you usually want to save for last. But Dogmatica Punishment, I just run as a one-of as extra monster removal. And then Shaddoll Schism, you have to run this in any Shaddoll deck that you're playing with. You can fusion summon with materials from your graveyard, and as an added bonus, if used during your opponent's turn, the monster that you special summon, you can banish a monster that your opponent controls that has the same attribute. So it's a nice way to get extra monster removal, like the El Shaddoll fusion. It's just a nice, neat way to get Winda onto the field during your opponent's turn to prevent them from special summoning. And it is a must-have, but I do keep it as a one-of. And going into the extra deck, this is where things get kind of like a little funky. So the extra deck that I'm currently running, as far as Shaddolls go, I only have 1 Shaddoll Winda. I play 2 Shaddoll Apgalone, and I play 1 El Shaddoll Construct. The reason I have 2 Apgalones is because when it's sent to the graveyard, it can actually search from the deck. The other 2, Winda and Construct, when they're sent to the graveyard, they can only add spell or traps from the graveyard, whereas Apgalone can add a monster or a spell trap, whatever you need for the situation that you're currently in, from the deck, as long as you discard another card. It also has a secondary effect where I can target, when it's summoned, I can target a card on my opponent's side of the field and negate its effects. So this is a card that I definitely like to have 2 of. The Construct I feel like is okay at 1. You could swap in a second copy, but I don't really feel the need to have a second copy. Winda, on the other hand, is definitely one that you want to have 2 of. Just in case your opponent has a way to get rid of the first one, you want to be able to go into that second copy. El Shaddoll Construct, when summoned, can send a card from your deck to the grave, a Shaddoll card. So you could send any of your Shaddoll monsters to get their effects off in graveyard, or you could instead send your Schism to guarantee that you get it into your hand once the Construct is sent to the grave, or you could send your Shaddoll Incarnation. A lot of things you could do with Construct. It's a great card, must have in the Shaddoll deck, of course. Moving on to the Invoked Monsters, I have 2 copies of Invoked Mechaba. This is easily the best and probably the one that you're normally going to go into anyway, as far as the Invoked Monsters go. It's an Omni-Negate, as long as you have the proper materials in your hand. If your opponent activates a monster effect, you send a monster from hand, negate, and banish that monster. Same with spells or traps, you just have to discard that corresponding card to whatever your opponent played. Next, I have Invoked Raijin. This is a Book of Moon. It's just a nice way to disrupt your opponent. Not one that I use very often, but it is nice to have. Same with the Invoked Caliga. This is one where each player can only use 1 monster effect per turn. So this is one that you would want to bust out once you've already built your board, just because it keeps your opponent from being able to use their monster effects for the most part. I don't go into this a lot, but it is something that I like to keep. If I had to choose, when I do eventually get my second copy of Winda, between Caliga and Raijin, personally I would keep the Raijin, just because I want to be able to use my own monster's effects. So I would drop the Caliga for the second copy of Winda, but to each their own. To each their own. It's just what I would personally like to do. But until then, until I do get that second copy, Caliga stays. And then finally we have the Invoked Augotus. Like I mentioned earlier, this deck doesn't have a lot of power. There's not a lot of really high attack monsters. None of them go above 3k. This is just a card that I have just to be able to get over those bigger monsters that I wouldn't normally be able to. Just because of its effect, I can banish a fusion monster in the graveyard and add the attack from that banished monster to Augotus here. I can get this Invoked Augotus to over 4k, and that's usually pretty good enough to beat most monsters that my opponent would have on the field that I'm struggling to get over. So Augotus is just a nice little utility option if in the event that I'm ever in a situation where my opponent has bigger monsters. Next we have Titanic the Ash Dragon and Elderly Entity Ints. These two are a part of the Dogmatika package. The purpose that they serve, Titanic when he's sent to the graveyard during the end phase of the turn that he was sent, I can add a Dogmatika card from deck to hand or special summon it. So you would normally want to send this card to the graveyard off of your Nadir's Servant. That way you can add your Ecclesia off of Nadir's Servant, and then at the end phase, once you've built your board, you can use Titanic to then add either the Fleur-de-Lis or the Maximus, whichever one you would want. And then Elderly Ints, it's just an extra pop. I like to pair this with Dogmatic Punishment, just for that extra pop. But its effect when sent to the graveyard, I can target a card on the field and destroy it. And then we have the Link Monsters. It's not a whole lot of Link Monsters, just these four, but they all have a very unique purpose for the most part. Artemis the Magistus Moon Maiden is linked over Alistar. It can also be linked over your Shaddoll Falco or your Squamata or your Ariel. There's a few of the Shaddoll Spellcaster monsters that that can be linked off of this one, but you mostly have it in here just as a light target to get into your Invoked Mecha. So the play is to normal summon your Alistar, get Invocation in your hand, link summon Artemis Mage, and then activate Invocation, banishing the Artemis as the light monster required to get out your Invoked Mecha. Gravity Controller is just a way to get your Shaddoll cards back into your hand. The idea being you would special summon your Shaddoll Construct or your Shaddoll Apgalone into the Link Monster Zone. That way you can use them as fodder for Gravity Controller, and in doing so you then get Construct or Apgalone's Graveyard effect to add a card from graveyard or deck to hand. So that is Gravity Controller's purpose in this deck. Braided Plant Verte is just an option to go into a fusion monster in the event that I don't draw one of my fusion cards, which can and will happen. So Braided Plant is just a nice option to have. And then Access Code Talkers is kind of the same deal as Anaconda. It's just a nice option to have. I'm yet to really use this, but it is nice to have in game just as a way to guarantee that you are ending it. But honestly, you could take this card out and swap it with a different extra deck monster, like a different Link monster if you wanted, or maybe an extra fusion, like a second copy of Construct or the second copy of Winda. Access Code isn't really necessary in this deck and doesn't really serve much purpose at all. It's just something that I personally like to run. But that is the Invoke Shaddoll's Dogmatika. This isn't the best build, isn't the perfect build. It's not the absolute most competitive, optimal build that you could have. But this build works for me. It's a lot of fun to play, and I just really enjoyed this build. So thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And y'all have a good one.